The rate of growth is starting to slow, we keep hearing, in the Sydney property market at least. Well, the strategy for buyers and sellers has to change too. Veronica Morgan from Good Deeds Property Buyers and host of Foxtel's Location Australia joins us now with some insights into what she's seeing in the market. Veronica, great to see you as always. Thanks so much. Firstly, we just wanted to ask, is that the sense you're getting, that the market is slowing in Sydney, and where are you seeing that?
Well, I operate on a day-to-day basis in inner Sydney, so of course when I talk about, from a first-hand experience, that's what I'm talking about. But there's certainly signs that people can look for across the country as to whether the market is slowing or not. And of course we've got to also remember that Sydney and Melbourne have been performing very, very differently to a lot of the other capital cities over the last few years as well. But in terms of a slowing market, the very first thing I look for in the area that I'm operating in is clearance rates, auction clearance rates.
And they're definitely coming down in Sydney from what we're seeing, aren't they?
They are. I'm struggling to hear you a little bit there, Bridie, but they are coming down in Sydney. But the thing is that we've been used to, over the last 4 years, we've got used to clearance rates in excess of 80%. Now, that's ridiculously high. And, I've been around in real estate now for 17 years, and certainly early on, we used to think anything in the 70s was high. Now, currently, the clearance rates for the last, say, 6 weeks or so have been hovering around about that 70 mark, and everyone's talking about the market crashing and being the end of the boom. And it might be the end of the boom, but it's certainly not a weak market when you're still talking about clearance rates around that level.
Yeah, they still look very high. And do you think that it's the bidders that are just dropping off, or are they hanging back, like the auction starting slower? How do you see the sign happening, like within the auction scene?
It's a good question, actually, because there's so much more to auction clearance rates than simply just the clearance rate. There's a lot underneath those numbers. Certainly, there are certain measures around, certain statistics around, for instance, where you can see the amount of people that have registered at auctions, and certainly that is lower than, say, a year ago. Anecdotally, when I'm at open houses, and certainly in New South Wales too, because you have to register for auction, whereas you don't in Victoria, for instance, you can see very clearly whether there's 20 people in a queue to register, or whether only 5 or 6. Now, still 5 or 6 makes a good auction, but and even if 20 register, you don't get 20 people bidding. So those numbers of people actually registering are lower. And I think too, if they look around and see that it's not quite as competitive, that fear of missing out doesn't kick in quite so hard. So potentially the actual bidding is a little saner.
And are there signs that you look for, days on market, or any vendor discounting going on? Are you seeing that? Are they other signs that you're watching for?
Absolutely. Look, clearance rates are really important in auction-oriented areas, so say inner Sydney and inner Melbourne particularly, but certainly in other areas where private treaty is a big selling method, or a widely used selling method, then they are two measures that you can look at to sort of work out whether the market's slowing or not. Now, days on market means how long is a property on the market before it sells, and obviously if it's going to take longer, then you can see that there's less buyers around, or less competition, or you're not getting the prices that the vendors want. And certainly the same deal with vendor discounting, and that's really where owners are putting a high price on their property and find that they have to actually discount that price in order to actually get a buyer.
And do you think, Veronica, we're notoriously coming to a quieter time normally in winter, and yet the auction rate's been higher? We're now getting close to spring, where a lot of homes come on the market. Do you think that that's going to push the figures back up? Do you think that's going to be reflected with the change of season?
It might actually happen the opposite effect. Stock levels is, as I said, that auction clearance rates, there's a lot of underlying factors that contribute to those rates, and stock levels are one of those, factors. So in winter, traditionally, you have less stock on the market, so of course there's more buyers per property. Now, when you come into spring, when traditionally there's more property hits the market, quite often clearance rates actually fall. That happens nearly every year. I think in my 17 years in the industry, it's happened 14 out of those 17 years. It didn't happen last year, but it did happen in 2015, and I think it will happen this year as well.
What sort of tips can you offer buyers then if they are noticing those signs that things are just cooling slightly?
I only got half that question. I think you asked what could buyers do. Is that correct?
Yes.
Well, how should they respond? Well, I think the thing to remember is that there are different types of market cycles. There are areas where the market is very, very cyclical, and you have to be very careful in those areas not to buy at the peak or at the beginning of the downturn. And you really need to try to buy at the bottom of a cycle. But in other areas, such as, you know, we're talking inner Sydney or inner Melbourne, for instance, those suburbs don't tend to behave in quite the same way. So buyers really should be always focused on buying quality property. And if you're focused on that, it really doesn't matter what the market conditions are, as long as you work out what's quality and what's a good price to pay.
Yeah, I agree. It's always quality, and I think that we've talked a little bit too about the glut of apartments, particularly in Sydney. There's developments everywhere you drive. I wonder how you see that in you know, impacting the apartment market and then the flow on to the housing market.
Well, it's interesting because the market for new stock and the market for established stock really behaves very, very differently to each other. So obviously that new stock, once it gets sold a second time, that becomes established stock and moves into that other market. And so you often see, there are stats around that show that there's a very high proportion of new properties that when they actually sell at a loss versus established stock. So, you know, the markets behave very, very differently. I think that in many cases, good new development can actually enhance the established stock in an area. I mean, Chippendale is a good example in Sydney, where there's a massive complex that was developed a few years ago, Central Park, and the surrounding properties have absolutely benefited from the lifestyle and the restaurants and the shops and all that sort of that sort of amenity that's been brought into the area because, and I guess enabled by the sheer volume of people living there now. So there are benefits to the established stock around the surrounding areas, but you've still got to be careful because you don't want to be caught up in that oversupply problem.
Are you seeing that investors are not as active?
Well, I think there's a lot of people who would like to invest, but obviously APRA have been putting the squeeze on the banks in terms of their lending criteria, and the banks have responded by really tightening up the way in which they do lend to investors. I found, certainly a lot of my clients, for instance, have found it much harder to get the amount of money they thought they would be able to get. Previously, they would have been able to borrow a lot more money before, you know, these tightenings of, or these measures have been put in place. So that certainly is having an impact. So I think there's still a willingness of people to invest, but whether they're actually able to, given the constraints on their borrowing, that is definitely having an impact.
I suppose, you know, people, there's homeowners out there selling and getting in fear. I think the old story is watching when you know, buying and selling within the same market. If it's amazing or if it's bad, you still should be okay as long as you don't leave it too long between selling and buying again.
Look, that's true to a point, but I think there are different market dynamics, and there are times when it's better to upgrade, for instance, or downsize. So if the market's falling, then that's not a time to downsize. If the market's rising, it's much harder to upgrade because, of course, the gap between your smaller property that you're selling or your less expensive and the more expensive gets bigger and bigger with a rising market, and vice versa with the downsizers in a falling market. So you've got to pick your market when you do that. Certainly, I know that you know, I'm often talking to people about whether they should sell before they buy or vice versa, and a lot of it is about their own risk, their own, you know, appetite for risk, but also their capacity to be able to fund a second property should they need bridging finance. But, you know, basically I always say that if you're going to sell first or buy first, the focus is on doing the most difficult thing first. So in a buyer's market, for instance, selling first may be the most difficult thing to do, and that might be a good idea. So you've got to look at the greater market and how that's functioning.
And do vendors, I guess, do they need to at the moment in parts be more conscious of what's going on and perhaps adjust price, or, you know, can they still get these amazing prices that we've been seeing some homes go for?
Well, this is an interesting question because I guess what I see in a rising market, vendors pretty much always, regardless of market conditions, that owners always want a bit more for their property than a buyer might be really willing to pay if there's only one buyer. So they rely on competition to actually push a buyer up.